and we're thrilled to have such an interest in such a typically kind of boring topic of zoning. But we have a great speaker with Dr. Jenny Schuetz from Brookings Institute. First, a couple things. We are recording this. There were a number of people that were interested, but were not able to make it. So we'll have that available hopefully tomorrow. And a little bit about Livable Cville. We're a grassroots group here in town that has a mission of advocating for policies to build an inclusive Charlottesville area with affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and healthy neighborhoods that are welcoming for all. Quickly, to explain why we're having this talk and how it fits into other things, the Cville plans process, we're sort of in year 6 of that, and it started in 2017 as we started to rewrite the 2018 comprehensive plan. That kind of stalled out, and we ended up hiring some consultants to help with the plan. They started working on it in early 2020, and they were charged with creating 3 things: an affordable housing plan, a comprehensive plan, and a new zoning code. So the affordable housing plan was passed by City Council March of 2021. The comprehensive plan was passed in November 2021. So now we've moved into the zoning rewrite, which is going to last until about a year from now, hopefully. And our 2 phases to the zoning rewrite. The first phase that we're in now is going to involve reviewing the zoning code, thinking what kind of changes could happen, and developing an approach to develop those changes. So it's sort of the plan before the plan. And there will be some community outreach with that. And then in the second half of this year, they're actually going to rewrite the code. There'll be revisions. It'll go before the Planning Commission and ultimately to City Council. So to help educate ourselves and our community, we wanted to bring someone in who could help us think about how zoning relates to affordability and accessibility in Charlottesville. So we invited Dr. Schuetz, and she's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute in DC. She's an expert on urban economics and housing policy, about which she's done extensive research and writing. She has a master's degree in city planning from MIT and a PhD in public policy from Harvard. Prior to working at Brookings, she worked at the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve and taught at University of Southern California and NYU, among other places. But I think what made me really excited to have her as a speaker, she's actually from Virginia. She grew up in Blacksburg, and her undergrad degree is in economics, political, and social thought from UVA. And she recently authored this book, Fixer Upper, which is an accessible book about how to fix the housing mess in our city. So she was really generous with her time, and we're really appreciative of her joining us. So she's going to take over. I'd encourage you all to pay attention. If you have questions you would like to ask either during or at the end, the chat function set so messages will go to just me and Stephen Johnson, who's helping out with this, and Dr. Schuetz. We'll have a time of question and answer after she presents. And stick around, we're going to have an announcement at the end about our next event coming up in April. So Dr. Schuetz, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew and Livable Charlottesville, for inviting me. It's always nice to get a call from Charlottesville, and I wish I could be back there in person, but Zoom is better than nothing. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides to go through. So those showing up, you guys can see full screen slides. Awesome. Great. So thanks for giving me a chance to come and talk to you. And just to give you a little bit of preview, I've got kind of a 3-part presentation. So I'll go through some of the big highlights and themes from the book and try as best I can to relate them to Charlottesville's context and to the regional context. And then I'm going to give you just a couple of data points about the Charlottesville housing market that help me think about it, the particular challenges that it's facing, And Matthew had mentioned that you're considering an inclusionary zoning component of the affordable housing plan. And so the last piece, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about inclusionary zoning, how programs have been structured before, and what we know about how well they work, depending on the way they're designed and implemented. So it will feel a little bit disjointed because we're covering a bunch of territory. So the large context for why Charlottesville is having this conversation, why the whole country is having this conversation, is that at a national level, the US hasn't been building enough homes to keep up with demand for about a decade, really since the Great Recession. Production of new housing just plummeted, and so we aren't building enough homes to meet population growth and job growth. And the problem is particularly acute in metro areas that have very strong job markets, like Charlottesville. So the problem is that we haven't built enough homes in the places where people most want to live, where there are well-paid jobs and amenities. Virginia is actually not as bad as much of the country. I lived for a while in California, which is ground zero. California, New York, and Boston haven't built enough homes for 30 years, so they have an enormous deficit and housing prices are just through the roof there. In Virginia, this is really about a decade-long problem, and the good news is that you have not dug yourselves in the hole so deeply that you can't get out of it, but this is also a really opportune time to think about what's not working and fix it. And I will say both the sort of catching up to the gap on the production side and the politics become much, much harder as the problem wears on and becomes more acute. And so I think it's great that you guys are leaning into some options for change now. One of the problems behind the reason why we haven't been building enough housing is that we've kind of locked ourselves into some land use patterns that just don't allow more homes to be built, especially in close-in neighborhoods, close to jobs and city centers. So it's pretty common in most of the US to have what we call single-family exclusive zoning, meaning the only kind of structure that you can build on a piece of land is a single-family detached house with a yard, so like the image on the left, and that prohibits virtually anything else from being built there, whether it's townhouses, duplexes, mid-rise apartment buildings, tall apartment buildings. Just the single-family detached home is the only thing you can build. This runs into just a geometry problem that once you have a neighborhood that is built out with single family homes and it's only allowed to be developed as single family homes, you literally can't add any more housing, right? So we've created an artificial cap on housing capacity in many of our neighborhoods, which if they were open land today, they would probably be developed as 4-story apartment and condo buildings because the land is quite valuable. It's important to recognize there isn't just one rule that's keeping development from happening. So single family exclusive zoning or bans on apartments is certainly one of them, but things like large minimum lot sizes, which in Albemarle County, I'm sure you have neighborhoods where it requires 1 to 2 acres of land to build a single house. That's going to make it very difficult to build small, moderately priced homes as well. Things like historic preservation rules can also come into play where it makes it hard to tear down existing structures, which will have to happen to some degree to allow new development. So it's important to understand this is capping our production. Large homes on large pieces of land are more expensive, and so this is particularly tough for lower income households. And this also has distortions on the types of developers who can get into the business of building housing. So in particular, the kind of small, what we think of as gentle density duplexes and fourplexes, those are the kinds of homes that often get built by small locally owned builders who essentially can't compete with the big national companies on a larger scale. So we've really changed the development environment quite a bit by these rules. It's not just about the rules that are written down on paper. We have also created a process of approving housing that is very slow and unresponsive. And in particular, local governments who approve development processes have essentially delegated a lot of the political power over development to existing residents, and particularly to longtime homeowners who tend to be very involved and show up at community meetings. So it's understandable that people are concerned about changes to their neighborhood. Having new homes increases the number of people nearby. This can increase demands on schools and parks and roads. So people understandably want a voice in change happening to their neighborhood. But giving existing residents, and especially very long-term homeowners, veto power over all new development that they don't like creates some serious economic costs, environmental costs, and social costs that are borne by other people in the community, that are borne by the region. And at this point, the country overall is suffering economically from this underproduction of housing. We know from research, for instance, that at a national level, GDP has actually grown by about 36% less than it would have because of very strict land use regulations in places like California and most of the East Coast. So these are some real numbers. And to think about how this works at a regional level, if people who earn lower incomes, people who are housekeepers and baristas and work in food service are not able to live close to their jobs, then we push them to outlying areas. Towns like Charlottesville often have difficulty retaining qualified graduates from the university because they can't get a job nearby. Firms are unable to hire and retain good workers because housing is just hard to come by, right? So this hinders the overall region's economic growth. There's a second related problem of affordability that I want to draw a little bit of distinction with, which is that poor households everywhere in the US have a hard time affording market rate rent just because they earn too little money. And this is not a problem that's necessarily coming from underproduction of housing. It's because incomes, particularly at the low end of the wage scale, haven't kept up with inflation, haven't kept up with the cost of living. Construction costs have gone up much higher, and just the operating costs of renting an apartment are higher than a lot of people can afford. So about 10 million renter households are spending more than half of their income every month on rent. That doesn't leave enough money left over to pay for things like food and transportation and healthcare. Because this is primarily a gap between income and the operating cost of housing, the way to fix this is providing direct public subsidy. So that can come through things like housing vouchers or giving people cash, for instance, through the child tax credit or universal basic income. This is something that's worth noting, but it's not primarily a local government problem or something local governments can solve on their own. Because this is a national problem and just the scale is very large, the federal government really needs to be responsible for providing more subsidy. Obviously, there's only so much that you can do about that, but pester your congressional delegation and tell them that it's really important to provide more housing vouchers to low-income renters. It's also really important, I think, for us to understand this isn't just a problem for poor people. Many of the families that are unable to pay rent, that are financially stressed, are families with children. So we have a lot of families with kids who are living in either poor quality housing, overcrowded housing, very high levels of financial stress, unsafe and unhealthy neighborhoods. If we want to have a healthy, well-educated, productive workforce 20 years from now, we need to be investing in better quality living environments for all of our kids today. The flip side of our broken housing production system is that we have built a lot of homes in the wrong places, and we continue to do that. So environmentally speaking, there are two ways to think about this. One is that we are continuing to build and rebuild homes in places that persistently have natural disasters, climate-related problems. So many parts of Virginia, for instance, that are in the valleys have persistent flooding during heavy rains. And there are areas where we wouldn't allow new houses to be built, but there are people who already live there. The other part of this that is sort of easy to imagine in the Charlottesville context, there are a lot of people who can't afford to live close to their jobs at UVA, at the medical center near downtown Charlottesville. Those people don't just disappear, they go look for cheaper housing in Louisa or Nelson or Greene counties. So you have low-income workers who are pushed to cheap housing on the outskirts of the region. They spend more time commuting. These are car-dependent locations, so we have higher greenhouse gas emissions and higher environmental damages for the entire region, right? So not building homes close to jobs means more people living in these either risky or vulnerable areas from a climate perspective. We also know that homeownership is really at the root of the very large and persistent racial wealth gap. So the US relies very heavily on homeownership as the primary means of wealth building. There are subsidies built into the federal tax code, the mortgage interest deduction being the best known, that encourage people to save primarily by buying a house and building up equity. But We know that Black households in particular have been excluded from homeownership for a very long time through legal discrimination and then through ongoing discrimination, which is illegal but is not consistently enforced. Because of that, Black households are much less likely to own their home. And even when they buy their home, they're much less likely to have a lot of equity built up. So you can see here, white homeowners have about double the home equity of Black homeowners. There's also a downside to encouraging people to save their entire nest egg in their home. Homeowners become very protective of their home equity, and they are financially motivated to push back against any kinds of changes that might threaten their property values, like building low-income housing in their neighborhood. So we have now personal incentives and financial incentives for homeowners to push back against development that really needs to occur, and to push back against essentially opening up high opportunity neighborhoods to lower income households. This winds up reinforcing existing patterns of racial and economic segregation. There's also a sort of a direct financial self-interest by local governments. Local governments rely heavily on property taxes to pay for public services like schools and parks and roads. Property taxes depend on the value of properties in the jurisdiction. And so many local governments become reluctant to approve smaller, moderately priced housing, including rental housing, because they think that it will cost them more in services than it brings in revenues. And I will say that research is not entirely consistent with that often approving, for instance, apartments has relatively low cost for local governments because they tend to be small renter households and actually have fewer children who go to public schools than single family homes. But there's this very deep belief that apartments and low-cost housing will be a net fiscal loss for local governments. One of the options to get around this is to do more sharing of revenues across local governments within a region that can both help equalize the quality of public services across poor and wealthy jurisdictions and take away some of this disincentives for local governments to say no to housing. So you've probably gotten a sense that we have a number of different problems. To fix these, we really need systemic policy changes from all levels of government and widespread across the country. At the local level, local governments control the rules that govern housing production. And so the answer is going to be to reform those, and particularly to allow a more diverse set of housing types, more types of structures, more sizes, at a wider price range, ideally in every community, so that every community can accommodate workers at different levels of income and households of different sizes and ages and preferences. At the state level, state governments play some really important roles in setting the framework within which local governments operate, both in delegating zoning and land use authority and in setting aside the kinds of fiscal tools available to local governments. So there's a really promising role for state governments to create financial carrots and sticks that nudge localities towards pro-housing reforms. And this can be also viewed as providing some political cover for local governments. So some localities would like to allow more high density housing, low income housing. If there was a carrot offered by Richmond, then the city council members in Charlottesville could say, look, we have to do this. This is something coming down the road for us. And that makes it easier for them to go to their voters and push for policy changes that quite often they want to make already. The state government can also help with revenue sharing to equalize these costs across localities. And then finally, the federal government has a primary role to play in providing direct financial assistance to low-income households. Only the federal government has deep enough pockets. And it's really important that we provide decent quality, stable, and affordable housing to everybody as part of the overall social safety net. It's not that we don't have good ideas. Many of the ideas that I'm proposing in my book are not original to me. Many of these have been floating around for years. So we have lots of ideas about how we could get to better outcomes. The problem always comes back to the wicked hard politics of making these changes. So people who benefit from the status quo, including quite a few middle and upper income homeowners, are reluctant to embrace changes, both in their neighborhoods and policy changes and things like tax policy changes. The people who stand to benefit the most from some of these policy changes tend to be younger households and renters. They are less engaged in the political process. They are underrepresented among elected officials, often face barriers to participating in the political process, everything from showing up to community meetings to voting. And the groups that would stand to benefit have also not, I think, made the kinds of coalitions that would allow them to build bridges between, say, pro-housing, pro-zoning reform groups and traditional affordable housing advocacy groups, although they share a lot of interests in common. I will say that the last couple of years have given me some reasons for hope, for optimism. We are seeing much more public interest and attention to this issue, to the problems of widespread housing unaffordability. There's much more recognition that our zoning laws are a big problem and will need to change. One of the particularly encouraging trends is that more state governments are realizing that this impacts them at the overall state economic level, and climate impacts and equity impacts. And so state governments are much more engaged. Virginia is sort of tiptoeing in that direction, and I'll be interested to see what happens in the next couple of years. The state jailer, I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for, but your Legislative Audit Review Committee wrote an excellent report that they published in December, recommending a number of changes for both statewide housing subsidies and for more kind of monitoring of conditions and potentially some land use reforms. If the legislature decides to take that up, I think that's moving in a very promising kind of direction. So the book is really intended to provide more insights into this for a non-expert audience. My goal is very much to get people who aren't currently engaged in the housing debate to realize that this matters, that this impacts them. That goes for a lot of homeowners who are comfortably housed today, to realize that your regional economy doesn't work as well as it could, that climate change is coming for your house as well, and that the future of our workforce really depends on providing better housing conditions for low-income households. So my hope is that more people read this, get engaged, show up at community meetings, get involved with Livable Charlottesville, call up your city council members and your representatives and say, hey, look, this stuff matters, and it's time to have some more productive discussions. Because I really think that some of these changes feel like in the short term, they're going to be changes to winners and losers, but most of these would have long-term economic and environmental gains for the entire country if we can get ourselves there. So I want to give just, that's sort of the wrap of my book. I'll give you just a couple of quick slides on Charlottesville to highlight what I think are some areas that we can talk about. So I always like to look at the regional context. This is a graph just showing the change in population over about a 10-year period on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, this is measuring the median housing value in the city or county relative to the median income for the metro area. And you can see Charlottesville and Albemarle are both expensive places, which you all know, you don't need me to tell you that. We generally think that a house value to income ratio above 4 is difficult for many people to afford. And this is also, so it's not that the entire region is expensive or supply constrained, but what this is likely telling us is that many households are going to be priced out of Charlottesville and Albemarle, and they're going to be looking for cheaper housing in more remote counties, which is obviously going to contribute to regional traffic congestion and environmental impacts. This is a sort of a handful of metrics that I like to look at. If you're interested more in sort of what these metrics tell you, the link at the bottom will give you some more information. But two of the numbers to highlight in particular, the income needed to pay median rent. So that's the bottom of the second set of rows here. This is figuring out if a household is going to spend 30% of their income on rent, how much would you need to earn in order to afford the median apartment for rent in one of these communities? And so this is telling us that households making less than about $46,000 a year are going to have a really hard time renting the median apartment in Charlottesville. And for sure, you've got a lot of households who fall below that. So that's sort of the cutoff below which people just really can't afford to live in the community. The bottom two numbers, the share of homes built before 1940 and after 1990, give us a sense of sort of when production is happening. So Charlottesville has more older homes than Virginia on average does, and Virginia's got a lot of older communities, and not a lot of housing built post 1990. So, 20 percentage points lower than Albemarle, considerably less than Virginia overall. That is another indication that the city has not been building enough housing to sort of meet demand in recent years. And that also starts to give you some concerns about the age of housing and the quality of housing. Older homes just take higher maintenance. So these are a couple of kind of metrics that I would watch. And then for the sort of last couple of slides, I want to talk a little bit about inclusionary zoning, just giving some broad information framework. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, inclusionary zoning is a set of policies that either require or provide incentives for developers who are building market rate housing to set aside some of their units for lower income lower income residents. These can be either for sale or for rental. And just to give you a sense of how this works, so a mandatory inclusionary zoning program might require, for instance, that out of a new apartment building, 10% of those apartments have to be set aside for tenants who earn less than 80% of the area median income. And all of those sort of pieces can be tweaked, but that's sort of a typical ratio that maybe 10% of the units have to be affordable. In an incentive version of this, local governments will offer, say, a density bonus. If you set aside 10% of the units for low-income residents, we will allow you to build 15% more units than you would be allowed under the baseline zoning. San Diego has a very nice voluntary density bonus program that's actually been quite effective at producing both affordable units and extra market rate units. So this is sort of the broad outline, and one takeaway is that inclusionary zonings can be and have been designed in a lot of different ways. There's sort of a whole menu of choices to be made when creating an inclusionary zoning program, and these are often used in conjunction with other things, either sort of an overall rewrite of the zoning code or potentially with some dedicated subsidy programs. IZ is an increasingly popular policy among local governments to create below market rate housing. And part of the reason that it's popular is that it doesn't rely on an ongoing public subsidy. So this is not the equivalent of, say, building additional public housing where the government is providing an ongoing subsidy. It pushes essentially the responsibility for providing below market housing onto private rate developers and onto the market rate tenants. One of the key functions of IZ that's kind of baked into it is that it's pro-cyclical, meaning that you only get below market units when you get more market rate development. So in a hot housing market where developers are building a lot, you will get more of the affordable units. If the market cools and developers aren't building that much, you won't get a lot of affordable units. It's nice to have some programs that are counter-cyclical so that you are getting affordable units at the time when you go into a recession, for instance, but that's not the way IZ is structured, and that's just built into the way it's designed. One of the really important questions is, well, if you're creating some affordable units and there isn't a direct subsidy, how does that get paid for? There are a couple of different options that depend mostly on the local market conditions. So it's often sort of nice to think, well, developers are making these giant profits and they can just take lower profits. So it just comes out of the developer's pocketbook, and that's okay. We're happy about that. They're fat cats taking home a lot of money anyway. That can be the case, but quite often what happens is that developers will only build IZ projects if they are able to pass along the costs of this to people who either buy or rent the market rate units, right? So they essentially raise the price or the rent on market rate units in order to do a cross subsidy within the project of the below market units, right? So, that may be worth it, but it does mean that the market rate units will be more expensive than they would be otherwise. And the people who can afford them have to earn higher incomes. Depending on how the market is working, it may be also that this decreases land values. And so people who currently own the land will see their land values drop. This is, you're probably getting the flavor that there isn't one way that IZ works. This is very dependent on the local housing market conditions and also on how the program is designed. We have some data on how effective IZ has been at producing below market housing. So this is giving you a comparison in some of the regions that have a lot of IZ and where it's been around for quite a while. This is very popular in California, the Boston suburbs, DC, most of the suburbs, and the city have IZ programs. New York's is relatively new, and New York's is a little bit different because it comes with an active subsidy from the local government as well. So to give you a sense of comparison here, this is showing you how many IZ units are produced on average per year relative to the number of affordable units that are built under the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is our primary subsidized housing production program. And you can see in all of the regions, we're building a lot more affordable housing through LIHTC than we are through inclusionary zoning. Montgomery County, Maryland has the oldest IZ program and has built a lot. Most of their production happened in the first decade or two of the program because they were doing a lot of greenfields development, where it was relatively easy to sort of increase the number of homes in a subdivision. Their production has slowed a lot recently. The Boston area suburbs have built essentially no affordable housing, but many of those are suburbs that are frankly very hostile to affordable housing and never really intended to use the programs. There is not a lot of good research evaluating the impacts. This is very hard to do in part because every IZ program is different. And so it's really different to compare sort of overall outcomes. They are designed very differently and implemented very differently. The best research that we have suggests that IZ can produce some affordable housing under certain market circumstances. It does push the overall price of market rate housing higher and often reduces the total amount of construction. It's not really what you want to be doing, but this really varies quite a bit depending on the region of the country and the time period. So this is very market constrained. We do have evidence that programs that are very inflexible, that don't allow sort of variety of ways of satisfying it, are more strictly deterrents on new development. And then there's a couple of questions to think about as you move forward with planning and inclusionary zoning. It's helpful to start with just a sense of what the affordable housing goals are. And two of the questions that come up are, do you want to maximize the number of affordable units that you build? Or is this really more about economic integration, getting some affordable units into some high income communities that otherwise wouldn't build it? Often these two goals are hard to satisfy at the same time. So building units in very affluent communities is likely to be more expensive, and so you often get fewer of the units. Similarly, if you want to target very low income households, it's hard for the developer to make this cross subsidy work for very low income households. And so you often wind up with a really small number of units, a smaller share set aside. If this is targeted at, say, median income or even up to 120% of AMI, you're often able to get more units, but without as deep a subsidy. So these are just trade-offs to consider in thinking about the design. Really important also to consider how this fits with the local market context. Places that don't have strong demand for housing and strong prices and rents don't really work well with inclusionary zoning. This is meant to be a strong market component. It interacts a lot with what your neighbors have. So if your neighboring communities have IZ, it's harder for developers to evade it by going across the border. If you're the only jurisdiction in a region that has it, that often pushes development to other jurisdictions. And then the last thing, which is really important for local government to think about, what's your internal staff capacity for designing, implementing, overseeing, and administering the program? Inclusionary zoning programs can get very, very complicated in a hurry. And in order to make sure that developers are adhering with the requirements, that these are actually being administered, that you're tracking development as it comes online and making sure that the guidelines are imposed, that does require having dedicated staff, generally whose full-time job it is to run this. So that's kind of the hidden public subsidy, is that running an inclusionary zoning program does have some cost on local government, and think about designing one that fits in with the other kinds of programs that are already on your plate. So I will stop with that, and I look forward to all of the questions and reactions that you have.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I really appreciate your perspective. And I think that as we're thinking about, I mean, in some senses, Charlottesville has this kind of amazing opportunity. Like we've decided we we want to do this. We're serious about it. We're spending money on it. We've done our first major comp plan rewrite in, depending on what you count as major, at least since 2003, if not before then. And so I think there is a lot of excitement about the opportunity to do this better, especially as we all feel the increase in housing costs and the burden spreading to more and more people across different income levels. But I think we're also very nervous, besides the fact that Charlottesville has a lot of very nervous people here. We're also thinking that while these changes could have a lot of effects in other ways in other areas. And I think you helped give us some tools of like, well, the current system is having these effects, a lot of negative effects, both economically, environmentally, and pushing people out of communities they want to be in. And I think something you highlighted that I really appreciated in your book is the way in which exclusionary zoning ultimately also often excludes people from access to high quality schools, jobs, and other amenities. And I think we're seeing that happen in Charlottesville as people get pushed to the surrounding counties. But I've gotten a bunch of questions, a bunch of great questions. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to message me in the chat. But one that came from a few people is around the question of the role of outside investors coming into a community and buying up buying up properties with kind of either, I think usually they're using them to turn into rentals, but sometimes they want to flip them. And I guess I'd just be curious what you think some potential pitfalls of zoning changes encouraging more of that type of investment, but also maybe some ways that zoning changes could prevent that sort of speculation.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, certainly a timely one. I don't know whether Charlottesville has seen kind of a lot more investor action in the last couple of years, but there certainly are places that have. So two ways to think about this. One is that most investors are most interested in buying properties where they think that this is going to be a good long-term return. And places that don't have enough supply are really good places to be investor owners and landlords, right? Because you essentially don't have as much competition. We see this actually on the multifamily side a fair amount in expensive cities like DC and LA, where private equity firms are buying up older apartment buildings, renovating them and doubling the rents because there isn't enough new production, right? So older buildings become more valuable. Instead of filtering down and becoming more affordable over time, they get rehabbed and become more expensive as they get older because we are not building new apartments that would compete with them. And so, places like Houston and even, cities like Chicago that have traditionally built a lot of housing have had less of this problem because they just build new stuff. And so the older buildings really become the unsubsidized affordable housing, which is such an important part of the ecosystem. The other way to think about this is from the tenant's perspective. So we worry if private equity companies are bad landlords, if they don't maintain the properties, if they don't fix things when they break, they're more likely to raise the rent and harass tenants and push them out. We certainly worry about that, but we have a set of tools to push back against bad landlords, whether they are private equity firms or mom and pop firms, so things like enforcing housing code, making sure that the local government is checking to make sure that apartments are in good condition, having something like a hotline that tenants can call if the heat goes out in the middle of the winter and the landlord doesn't fix it. Providing good tenant services and good tenant protections is really important regardless of who owns the building. And most renters don't care who owns the building. They care whether it's a decent quality apartment and they're being treated fairly. And those are things that local governments should be doing and providing in any case.
Great, thank you. So another question is, obviously Charlottesville's housing market is, students play a significant role, and you probably could potentially make some distinctions between undergraduates and graduate students, but I guess I'd be kind of curious to know more about maybe healthy and unhealthy ways to think about student housing and how they could, I think they, because there's a high demand and they're a growing population, they maybe distort our market in a certain way. But what are some things the city and UVA could do to help kind of balance things out a little better?
Yeah, this is such an issue in every college town. Having grown up in Blacksburg, I saw a lot of this. I'm sympathetic to people who don't want to live next door to a house full of 6 undergrads who have parties all the time. One of I think the best strategies is for universities to make sure that they're providing enough on-campus housing, particularly for all of the students who want it, right? So very often students would like to live on campus. It's a shorter commute to their classes, and often students would be perfectly happy in a dorm without having to do their own cooking. But most students can't actually get a place in a dorm if they want to. And so universities should do more of that. And that's almost true across the board. Universities often don't want the legal liability involved with student housing. They don't necessarily want to be developers, but it's part of their responsibility, and providing more of that would be really helpful. Students living off grounds do put a lot of upwards pressure on rent, in part because students are often coming from families with resources. So their earned income as students doesn't really tell you their purchasing power. And they're also willing to live with lots of roommates, which most non-students aren't. So if you've got people who are willing to live with 4 roommates and share a space, each person can contribute quite a lot to the rent, and that pushes up the rent that, for instance, families with kids would not be able to afford. I think there's a bit of a healthy development of building purpose-built student housing that really works for a student population that's not quite tailored to non-students, as long as there is also production of just normal kinds of apartments that would be attractive to families. Graduate students are a different ballgame. Often they are in the same sort of price range and same budget constraints as non-students. Graduate students are older. Many of them are married and have kids. They're getting by on relatively limited income. But undergraduate housing, especially, I do think that the university stepping up and doing more of that could help relieve some of the pressures.
Do any college towns come to mind that have done this better than other places? Or and college towns tend to be very, very provincial on many levels, including.
Yeah, it's the colleges that tend to provide the most student housing are the smaller liberal arts schools, because they often are in communities that have very limited rental housing. They're small, and there's more of, for instance, a residential college culture that people want to be part of. I think William and Mary has a much higher share of students who live in dorms, and Williamsburg is obviously not that big either. But places like Williams and Amherst, because there just isn't rental housing nearby, and so dorms are a much larger part of that. But among the other kind of big college towns, Ann Arbor, Berkeley, Austin, they all have similar kinds of pressures. I'm grateful that Charlottesville doesn't have access to California's Environmental Quality Act. I would hate to think that Charlottesville would sue UVA for trying to build more student housing. I hope that UVA is thinking about doing more of this, and that they're working productively with the city to identify land that's appropriate for that.
Great. A kind of recurring question on the theme of environmental impacts is what sort of relationship in a community like Charlottesville has limited greenfield space, what impacts will having increased kind of the more gentle density have on, what environmental impacts will that have, particularly with respect to the tree canopy? There's been a lot of discussion here about our tree canopy keeps shrinking. And I guess, is gentle density and a good tree canopy, how can those things work together?
Yeah, some of that gets down to the nitty gritty of the parcels that you're building on, right? So if there are trees all over a lot, except for a single family house, and you want to replace that with a different structure, probably some trees will go. But very often, I mean, things like the accessory dwelling units have pretty minimal impact. Those can often be done, in a standalone garage or in a basement. And so it's not even really changing the structure that much. It's very feasible to build a duplex, a fourplex that's no bigger than a single family house. It's just configured differently internally. So that's one of the appeal of this approach, that you can often leave most of the neighborhood essentially looking the same on the outside, not even increasing the size or the bulk of the building, but just providing more units internally. There's such a tension too between the tree canopy in my neighborhood, in my literal backyard, versus tree canopy for the region, because the alternative is, if you don't add more housing in Charlottesville proper, particularly close to job centers, housing is still going to get built. It's just going to be added all the way up 29, and people are going to be driving much farther, and they're going to do a giant subdivision, across the Albemarle County boundary or across in, Louisa County. And a giant subdivision is going to take down an awful lot more trees than building a couple of duplexes and quads in Charlottesville.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think that'll be one of the sort of, there's been conversations starting around, as we start to think about zoning, we start talking about setbacks and how those can be managed in a way that will provide flexibility to allow varied housing types without sort of having homes built out to the maximal, either the edge of every single lot, or having house plus parking take up the entire parcel, and then it's just losing trees that way. So that's a helpful way to think of it, that we need to do the right kind of geometry in our zoning code to make sure we do have some green space still on our lots.
Yeah, and the climate impacts of housing, I mean, these are there are many, many layers to it. One of the other pieces to think about is that big single family houses use more water per house and per household than multifamily units, right? So multifamily units use less energy to heat and cool, which is only going to become more of an issue over time. They use less water per person and per household. So smaller, compact, denser units are better for climate on a whole bunch of dimensions, besides kind of the obvious tree canopy part. It is important to think about, if you're creating more impermeable space, by building, higher density buildings, that there are offsetting things like rain gardens. But realistically, most cities haven't done nearly enough of the other stuff already. So it's not a question of, we either keep single family neighborhoods with yards, or we build apartment buildings and have to deal with, climate impacts. We need to be doing both of those regardless.
Great. So this is kind of a little bit of the economics of housing, which I know you said in your book would have to be another book, but how that relates to some of the politics of this. So the question is, data or studies seem to indicate that in the long run, building more housing will bend the affordable housing curve in the right direction. But at the same time, it's sort of perceived sometimes that adding new housing will by itself increase housing, or increase costs, which then creates political backlash. So it's sort of like, I want affordable housing, I just want a certain type of affordable housing. And I guess maybe kind of how maybe we could think about, there's sort of macro level effects of building affordable housing, but then this worry that someone's own neighborhood will become less affordable because of things being added in their neighborhood.
Yeah, this is a really early area of research, but there are a couple of papers that have come out in the last few years that look at very micro scale impacts of building new housing. And so some of them are in New York. There's one that's multiple cities. It's a new one that just came out, I think, from Finland. And all of these papers are finding that even at a very localized level, at the neighborhood level, building new high-end apartments or condos actually brings down the rents of older apartments that are in the surrounding area. And one way to think about this is, if you've got a bunch of, say, 30-year-old apartments, and a brand new shiny apartment building gets built, that's now the most desirable housing, and there's a premium to be in that. The older existing buildings become a little bit cheaper, right? So these are mostly in the context of pretty large cities and expensive cities. But we have at this point pretty strong evidence that building more housing is going to bring down the rent somewhat, and that's going to help prevent displacement in lower income neighborhoods.
Could you briefly explain the concept of filtering? I myself cannot handle too much technical talk, but I think it's an interesting concept that I'm trying to learn about, and I think is applicable to Charlottesville, where I think we're filtering hard in the wrong direction. But if you could explain that idea and kind of how it relates to what you were just talking about.
Sure. So new construction is always going to be more expensive than older homes that are equivalent in kind of size and location, because construction is expensive, right? So you have to pay for labor and materials. And new construction is going to be the best quality, right? It's going to have new doors and windows and be very energy efficient, brand new appliances. So brand new construction has always been expensive and has always mostly been built for high income households. But as housing ages, it depreciates like all physical structures. So, I live in an 80-year-old house, and the roof gets leaks, and you have things that need to be fixed. Every 15 years, you have to replace the HVAC system. So older homes physically depreciate and become cheaper over time. And traditionally, what we've done is build a ton of new, high-end housing for rich people. And then they move into those new homes and free up older homes, which then can sort of be moved into by middle-income households. And poor households have traditionally lived in the oldest, poorest quality housing, right? Which maybe in sort of the next cycle is going to get torn down and replaced with something new. That's the way it's supposed to work. Old housing is cheap, new housing is expensive. When we don't build enough new housing, what happens is that older households move into an 80-year-old house and they do a gut rehab, and then it becomes expensive because it's essentially new on the inside. And that takes the older stock out of kind of the cheap stock and means that poor households have fewer apartments that they can afford. And they're essentially competing with middle income households then for what's left over.
Yeah, we're seeing different iterations of this, but if you drive around, especially some of the neighborhoods in Charlottesville that have smaller, older detached single family homes, there are second stories going on the top of them, not to create a duplex, but to create instead of an 800 square foot house, a 1600 square foot house. And that for certain people is more between the access to amenities that those locations allow versus the availability of new construction. That's sort of what we're seeing. So that's the sort of filtering we don't want to see.
Yeah.
This is a question that kind of touches on the inclusionary zoning. And so the current, I don't understand all the nuances of it, but currently Charlottesville, at least in certain cases for certain rezonings, lets developers put money in an affordable housing fund instead of building. They basically give the option to the developer of building on site versus putting money in a fund. And I guess, do you have some thoughts on would it be preferable to have on site versus money in a housing fund?
So either one of those can work. The critical question is usually how much money do you have to pay in lieu of actually building something on site? And sort of whether it's a good deal for affordable housing production depends on how equivalent those are. So let's say that it would cost $250,000 per unit to build the affordable housing on site, and you're allowed to buy out by paying $80,000, right? That's not a good deal because the money that you're collecting isn't going to be enough to build units someplace else. One of the questions is sort of how small the projects are that apply to this. It's harder to do inclusionary zoning on small projects if you're only building, say, a 4-unit building and 10% of the units have to be affordable. It's essentially one of your 4 units, right? That's just hard to make that work. So you might want to have an in lieu fee for small projects where you figure it's not going to pencil out, but at least you're then getting some kind of a contribution. For larger projects, it would make more sense to enforce it. The other question is whether, if there is, for instance, a large site that the city or an affordable housing developer wants to buy and develop at scale as 100% affordable housing, having market rate developers essentially pay into a fund and then doing one large scale affordable development elsewhere might make sense just because of things like land availability.
Yeah, so recently the city approved 2 new developments that would have significant LIHTC funding as part of it, through the Piedmont Housing Alliance will be the main developer, but the extra funding needed to kind of bridge to get to that, no one knows where it's going to come from. I mean, there's some options, and it kind of touches some on your chapter in the book about infrastructure, where you said it's expensive but a good investment. But could be an interesting thing for us to think about as we develop our inclusionary zoning more, to think about, like, maybe getting some on-site units for 10 years isn't really as valuable as the sort of often significant return on investment we can get when we put money into dedicated projects. Someone asked, I get a lot of concern about this. I get a lot of concern about parking and traffic as relates to density. Can you speak on this issue?
Yeah, those are always issues. Density done well and done in conjunction with transportation planning should be less of an issue for parking and for traffic congestion, right? So the ideal is, you'd be building a ton of apartments along 29, along 14th Street, around the mall, in areas that are pretty well served by buses. And then the people who live in those apartments don't need to have cars, or more realistically for Charlottesville, have fewer cars per household, right? So like a good goal to go to is if you have a two earner household, that they can have one car and that they don't have to drive everywhere. Density that's done in conjunction with things like neighborhood serving retail is also really useful, right? So if you build apartments and on the ground floor you have a grocery store, you take away some of the need to make car trips. So all of these pieces need to fit together. Where are you building housing relative to transportation, relative to neighborhood retail and services, relative to jobs? And are you planning for all of these things to be in a scale that they support one another? So particularly as people are working from home more, there's less need for the day-to-day commute, but people still have to go to the grocery store and to the coffee shop and drop off their kids. If they can do all of that without having to drive, that's better for the climate, and that actually saves households potentially quite a lot of money.
Great. Well, there's a bunch more questions, but we will stop here. I've got announcement in just a second, but for those of you whose questions didn't get asked, we're going to have, these will be saved, and these are things that Livable Cville can help address in the future, because there's a lot of great questions going out. I wanted to thank you, Jenny, so much for taking your time to be with us and lending your expertise to Charlottesville. And I want to make a quick plug for our next event, and it dovetails with the topic you were just answering a question about. A very famous book in the field is called The High Cost of Free Parking by Dr. Donald Schuetz out at UCLA. Anyone who spends more than 30 seconds with me knows that I'm obsessed with the topic of parking. I'm a lot of fun at parties, even though I don't go to parties these days. But we reached out to Dr. Schuetz and said, hey, could you come talk to us about this topic? And he very kindly replied very quickly and said, I'm too busy, but Dr. Andrew Monshine at UVA studied with me, and he has a lot of the same thoughts as I do, and he knows Charlottesville well, and he would be better than me. So on April 27th at 5:30, we'll be doing a similar Zoom event with Dr. Monshine from UVA, and we're going to talk about how parking impacts the cost of housing in Charlottesville, how it has high cost in terms of the environment, and how it relates to making our city a pleasant, livable place to live. 20% of land in the city of Charlottesville is parking. So that's like, when we think about why we don't have trees as much as we should, a big chunk of it's actually because of parking. Another 13% of Charlottesville is roads. So a third of our town is either a road or a parking spot. So I think maybe we can reimagine what that would look like. And it also matters very significantly to affordability. So I think there'll be an Eventbrite invitation going out before too long. I think Stephen might be dropping that into the chat if you want to go ahead and sign up. But thank you all so much for coming, for such a great attendance. And you can feel free to email livablecville@gmail.com if you have any further questions. So thank you all very much.